Hello, you're watching Dialogue live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm Tian Wei. China dismissed media reports recently suggesting that DPRK had informed Beijing of plans to carry out more nuclear tests. The Chinese Foreign Ministry warned against any actions that could worsen the situation on the Korean Peninsula and said diplomacy is underway on the crisis. To understand more about the latest situation there after the DPRK recent nuclear tests, I'm joined in the studio for the first half of our show by Mr. Gui Yongtao, who is the assistant professor of the Peking University. Professor, before we go to a discussion with you about the latest situation, let's take a look at this background report.
The DPRK is the only country that has carried out nuclear tests in the 21st century.
The DPRK's third nuclear test has infuriated the international community.
We stand by our allies, strengthen our own missile defense, and lead the world in taking firm action in response to these threats.
Pyongyang's defiance has once again brought its neighbors concern. Shortly after the test, China once again expressed its strong opposition to such action.
The UN resolution will help realize the denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. China will continue to work with all parties concerned to resolve dispute through dialogue and consultation.
Hong Lei also denied reports that DPRK had told China it was prepared to carry out more nuclear tests or rocket launches this year.
I do not know where the Reuters report comes from. Maintaining peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia is in the interests of all parties and requires joint efforts by all parties. The current situation is sensitive and complicated.
The nuclear test has also sparked debate among the Chinese public.
As a responsible nation, China should go with the international community and start from the interest of the Chinese people.
If we don't put sanctions on the DPRK, things will go worse. After all, nuclear weapons will pose a threat to the region.
But are more sanctions the only answer? The West has long asked China to use its influence to restrain the DPRK from conducting nuclear tests. But some experts argue that China has done nothing wrong and will stick to its current position.
We have witnessed the zigzag of all this relationship happened. It's very unfortunate. And this does not mean that the six-party talk is already dead. As a matter of fact, I guess in the future we need to create or to cultivate the necessary conditions to revitalize the talk. And because this is certainly the only way to lead to any kind of fruitful and positive outcome in the future.
That is the latest information we can get about the nuclear crisis on the Korean Peninsula. Now with me in the studio once again, we have Mr. Gui Yongtao, who is the Associate Professor from Peking University. Professor, you are an expert about Japan in China. So let's start with a piece of news related to Japan, also, of course, related to the Korean Peninsula nuclear crisis. Today, Tuesday, the Director General of the Asia and Oceanic Department from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan, he is visiting Beijing, Mr. Sugiyama.
Yes.
And he is supposed to be holding talks with his Chinese counterpart. How important do you think the issue on the Korean Peninsula nuclear crisis is likely to top the agenda?
Well, of course, the North Korean recent nuclear crisis will top the priority for both parties, because actually the Chinese counterpart is Mr. Wu Dawei, who's in charge of North Korean problem.
And the six-party talks.
Yes, the six-party talks, say, head of delegation. So China and Japan do share, say, common security concerns over the Korean Peninsula, which is denuclearization and stability and peace. And Japan is trying to advance a new UN Security Council resolution sanctioning North Korea, which necessarily means that Japan and China needs sort of coordination and cooperation on this issue. So, of course, they will talk about North Korea.
Right.
And they also will talk about, of course, I guess, the island disputes between China and Japan, which are still holding the bilateral relations.
Whether it
tension.
is sanctions or punishment against DPRK, it is still unclear from the Security Council of the United Nations, because at this moment you see shuttling diplomacy is actually going on, right, underway. But do you think China and Japan, given their recent territorial disputes, will have the guts to entertain the thought of working together on the issue of nuclear crisis on the Korean Peninsula? Or rather, these recent territorial disputes very much likely sour the relations and therefore the confidence of one another to work together?
Well, we have to acknowledge that this nuclear crisis is a test to the bilateral ties between China and Japan. But we have to also look at the other, say, major parties to this problem. There is also differences between Japan, for example, and South Korea, and between Japan and Russia. And there's also problem between China and the United States. What all these parties should do is, for this moment, to say coordinate closely so that their differences will not prevent them from holding a common, say, line on this issue, so that the international community will have coordinated response to this problem.
Judging from the recent history regarding whether it's rocket launch or nuclear tests from DPRK, what are some of the major disagreements, let's say, China and Japan have had regarding how to deal with the crisis once it comes out?
Well, basically, I would say Japan's policy toward North Korea has been mainly driven by its domestic politics. The Japanese media has been long demonized North Korea as a country. And also, the current Japanese Prime Minister actually has made himself well known as a politician by playing up the North Korean threat. And so in recent years, Japan has enhanced its sanctions over North Korea unilaterally. But from the Chinese perspective, of course, China is against North Korea's nuclear program, but China does not believe that sanction will actually have any effective consequences in terms of denuclearization.
Now, here is the very delicate situation. It is regarding rather the nuclear arm development in the region. It is not just the DPRK, which just had the nuclear test. It is also about what Japan is likely to do in the region. Some suggest, media reports, expert suggestions, saying that Japan is only 6 months away of developing a possible atomic bomb, something like that. However, whether these suggestions are real or not to the reality is unknown. But given the sensitivity of the issue, what do you think might be the strong political reactions in Japan, and how will those translate into Japan's ambition of developing its military and developing particularly its nuclear program?
Well, it is true that Japan has accumulated the necessary technology and materials to build nuclear weapons, but it is mainly a political decision. And here, I would say that Japan is still under the limitation of both domestic public opinion and that from Japan's alliance with the United States, because the United States definitely will not allow either Japan or South Korea to develop their own nuclear weapons. That's also why the United States immediately reconfirmed that the nuclear umbrella will be offered to both South Korea and Japan after the recent test.
To what extent, though, after that confirmation from Washington about protecting both Japan and South Korea, is Japan, do you think, willing to accept more anti-missile system, for example, from Washington being installed in its own region and neighboring countries and regions?
Well, Japan has already, in the past 1 decade or so, deployed the ballistic missile defense system around the country, and technically, I would say those deployment will be effective enough in addressing the current North Korea nuclear capability. But again, the political discussion in Japan will drive Japan or force the Japanese government to further strengthening its missile defense system.
Finally, before we go to a break, we understand recently there has been a lot of crossfire of words, at least, between Japan and its neighbors. For example, particularly about some of the political ambitions of certain Japanese politicians, such as revision of the Constitution, particularly Article 9, which stated that Japan does not have the right so far, given its constitution nature, to provide aid, military aid, to any of its allies when the allies are facing crisis. However, there's supposed to be a revision of the Article 9 advocated by some politicians inside Japan. Therefore, things are going to change. Will the nuclear crisis on the Korean Peninsula, this time particularly, putting oil on the fire inside Japan to make that political argument even stronger?
Well,
and what does it mean for us?
Exactly so. This will provide the Japanese Japanese politicians an excuse for either strengthening the U.S.-Japan alliance by allowing Japan to resort to collective self-defense rights, or revise Japanese constitution in order to address the so-called North Korean threat.
Well, things are getting very complicated. It's already, but even more now. We are going to continue, Professor, our discussion about the latest situation on the Korean Peninsula right after this break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching a live edition of Dialogue coming to you from CCTV News. I'm Tian Wei. With me in the studio, we have Mr. Yang Xiyu, who's joining us for the second half of our show. He is a senior research fellow at the China Institute of International Studies, an expert on DPRK. And also with us for the second half, Mr. Guo Yongtao, associate professor from Peking University. Welcome to both of you. Gentlemen, it is not just Japan, which we talked about, Professor Guo, in the earlier half of our show. It is also about other neighboring countries of DPRK, for example, South Korea. The outgoing South Korean president recently made the remarks toward DPRK. He talked about DPRK now to corner itself further into a crisis. However, we all understand it is new leadership coming into South Korea. Will this specific nuclear test sour all the good feelings, if there were any, to begin with?
Well, first of all, I think the latest nuclear test will certainly greatly affect negatively the policy review and the policy making towards DPRK for the new presidency.
In what way, though?
In the negative way. Previously, many people speculated that the new President Park will conduct a sort of new policies, neither different from Lee Myung-bak and nor same as Mo Hyun or Kim Da-jung as a third path of the policy. However, the very provocative nuclear test will push Park and her team closer to Lee Myung-bak's policy direction.
Knowing that, many would really wonder what exactly is the intention of DPRK doing this nuclear test. Is it about putting itself back again to the center of the foreign policy decisions of different capital, or is it really about doing the test for the test's sake to develop its nuclear armed programs, if there were any?
Well, it's a really strategic and good question to everyone, including us. Actually, that is North Korean national determination to become a nuclear weapon stage for two reasons. Number one, for guarantee their national security, to correct the imbalance of the military capabilities between the North and the South backed by the United States. And secondly, they want to make a nuclear weapon as a card or as a leverage to put on their American policy, so that the U.S. has to pay strategic attention to this small, relatively weak country like North Korea. So that is the two purposes drive North Korea towards the nuclearization. That is the basic strategy. And technically, the previous two tests made North Korea in the middle point of the whole process of the nuclearization. So if they stop completely, that will mean they fail to become a nuclear state. So I'm sure they have the third, maybe they will have the fourth, even fifth, the nuclear test, so that they can complete their nuclear development.
Of course, that makes things much complicated in the region, including the relations among neighbors and the relations between some of the Asian countries in the neighborhood and that of the United States. Prime Minister Abe is about to visit the United States later this week. Of course, DPRK nuclear issue is very much likely on his agenda. But exactly what does it mean for the nature of relations between Tokyo and Washington, particularly given the fact that already there was the pivot to Asia, or rebalancing, as the United States called it recently, already toward Asia? Is this going to harden the thought of bigger U.S. role in the region, or is this going to make the U.S. politicians and diplomats have a second thought about the scape of their capabilities in the region?
Well, for those people in United States and Japan who want to strengthen the bilateral alliance, this actually provides another opportunity for them to justify their ambitions. But actually, we also see the differences between Japan and the United States on the, say, North Korean nuclear issue in the past, because when the United States moved North Korea from terrorist supporting state list, the Japan actually issued opposition to the United States stance. And this time we guess there is already some, say, argument in Japan that the United States should relist North Korea as a terrorist supporting state. And we are going to see how Mr. Obama and Abe will, say, coordinate their policy stances.
This is one of the very first diplomatic tests for Mr. Obama for his second term. Remember, Mr. Yang, for his first term, there seems to be no diplomatic breakthrough while he was mainly dealing with the domestic economic situation. Even though there was pivot to Asia, that was pretty much under the name of Secretary Clinton rather than Obama himself. For his second term, is DPRK, or the nuclear crisis in the region, likely to be a breakthrough for him? After that, I also want to ask, there are different arguments going on inside Washington right now, even among some think tanks, as to what to react, how to react, to what extent. Some argue Washington should react very firmly, unswervingly at the UN Security Council on sanctions and many other things. Others argue Washington should take a breath, because this is the very beginning of the term, to streamline all of the policies that Washington has towards Asia, particularly Northeast Asia, and therefore reach a reasonable scale of tools that Washington can use on the nuclear crisis. Mr. Yang, tell us about your thoughts on these very different issues.
Well, all the debates you mentioned exactly reflect Obama's position in a dilemma, strategic dilemma and a technical dilemma. On North Korean issue, they are dilemma already. U.S. experienced the Clinton-style policy and the Bush-style policy. Both of the policies were failed. And during the past 4 years, we haven't seen a matured Obama-style policy toward DPRK. They simply copied either Bush or Clinton's policies, but no success at all. So the debates reflects the dilemma that U.S. has no workable and useful means to work with North Korea. If you fundamentally, they have no way to make a military strike to solve this issue, but neither diplomatic means to solve. Why is that? Simply because U.S. has no stake big enough, neither carrots visible. So neither stake nor carrots. So what else for their diplomacy? Nothing. So resultless. That's their dilemma. So the dilemma stems from their politics. Say, if U.S. offer some carrots for a deal, then the domestic politics will make huge pressure for any of the administration, either Democrats or Republican.
But if they don't do anything, particularly during this first year in the office for Mr. Obama, the second year is going to be very difficult. Midterm election is coming.
Yeah.
Nothing can be done once again.
Yes, so I don't think Obama will make any kind of a breakthrough simply because they have no political capital to make a carrot for negotiating a deal with North Korea. Theoretically, if you go to negotiation, you need to prepare some carrots for trade. So you, North Korea, give us your nuclear weapon, and then I will give you what you want. That's an exact deal model. However, they want North Korean nuclear weapon, but they are not ready, far from ready, to put American carrots on the table. So there's no possibility for the deal. Say, you give me something, I can give you nothing. So that's not
nothing that can become a deal. But then it used to be the tactics of Washington, for example, Mr. Gui, that pressure can be put on China, on Beijing, to press China to do more, to press China to urge DPRK to do this and not to do that. But this time we witnessed that the statement from China is very much in line with several other countries in the region, and therefore that option for Washington also has to be scrapped off. And therefore there are lack of tools, and many wonder also whether lack of will to begin with.
Well, I would say that the United States and China this time has been coordinating effectively, and both sides have been satisfied with their agreement on how to address this issue. But as we have seen, the problem is that neither side have an effective option of really give a resolution to this issue. And so far, what both countries have done is to postpone North Korea's nuclear program, not stop that program. But we have now the risk of North Korea accelerating their nuclear program, and this could be an effective, say, some very negative influence upon U.S.-China bilateral relations. So imagine that when the leaders of both countries meet next time, they are not going to discuss very, say, positive, constructive cooperations, but this nuclear program, nuclear crisis again. And I would say neither side would see this as a development.
Well, while we are discussing the impacts of the nuclear crisis, what does it mean for relations between the neighbors in the region and also the Asian countries and that of the United States, there's one thing we really need to discuss also, very important, which is non-proliferation. That has been an issue long put away by many who are very busy with the current day diplomacy. Back in the 1960s, non-proliferation treaty was signed by some of the biggest nuclear powers in the world. And now it's already got 189 members. 189 signed on it. But have we seen, gentlemen, over the past few years, real significant development when it comes to non-proliferation treaty? Real actions of biggest nuclear powers to cut back their possessions of nuclear arms so that the world can be a safer one, even though we are talking about deterrence these days still. Mr. Yang.
Well, I think the NPT regime now is in a very critical point and a very dangerous situation because of the two nuclear crises, North Korean nuclear crisis and Iranian nuclear crisis. If we fail to solve both of the crises, I'm afraid both of the crises will put the NPT regime in collapse. And we need, the whole world need the NPT regime sustainable. The former Secretary General of UN, Bulgari, pointed out, thanks to NPT regime, we prevented the world from emerging 40 to 50 nuclear states during the past few decades. So just imagine, if we have no NPT or the NPT collapse, we will have numerous nuclear states, even nuclear individuals.
Right.
That would be disastrous for all humankind.
Well, of course, for DPRK and the Iranian nuclear crisis, everybody know of these crises. But what about the responsibilities of big nuclear power countries? What can they do to serve their responsibilities according to the NPT? Not only to reinforce others, but also to restrict their own.
Yep. First of all, the the primary nuclear power should conduct a serious arms control disarmament, nuclear disarmament, to make a model for everyone and to make equal footing situation for every nuclear power. And secondly, regarding to the two nuclear crises, the major nuclear power should be responsible for a comprehensive deal. For example, Iran or North Korea, to negotiate with both of the countries for a fair deal. Just like I mentioned earlier, if you want to make a deal with North Korea, you are ready. U.S. has already to make a list of North Korea say you should give up 1, 2, 3, 4. But meanwhile, for the other nuclear power, should be ready either for their own how to provide for 1, 2, 3, 4, so that make a matching deal as a fair solution.
Before we go, there were reports talking about further tests coming from DPRK, and according to the strategies advocated by Pyongyang, there seem to be possible more nuclear tests in the near future. When this crisis is still boiling, we are already seeing the next crisis possibly coming. And therefore, this is really a test of both the political and diplomatic capabilities and resolve of all of these new leadership coming into different countries, Asia, the United States as well. What do you expect? How do these leadership likely to handle this issue?
Well, personally, I would suggest that all the parties concerned make preparations for long-term solutions, rather than be, dragged by North Korea's provocative actions.
Mr. Yang.
I think the current all the major power or major countries should regard the current situation in a long-term and a strategic background to draw. Now, let me put it by this way. Now, the fundamental problem is we have no mature strategy to deal such a strategic challenges. Right. And secondly, we have far from the coordinated strategies among powers. So before we restart the process of dealing with the problems, we should have a responsible strategy. We should have a coordinated strategies together to commonly deal with the common challenges.
The nuclear crisis on the Korean Peninsula has put a big question mark in the air. How are countries going to respond to it, and whether they are going to respond to it effectively? And we are going to have more time to put answer to that big question mark. Hopefully, they're going to be successful answers. We want to thank both of you for coming over to our studio, Mr. Gui Yongtao and Mr. Yang Xu. Thank you so much, gentlemen. And thank you for watching. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing.
Unfortunate. And this does not mean that the six-party talk is already dead. As a matter of fact, I guess in the future we need to create or to cultivate the necessary conditions to revitalize the talk. And because this is certainly the only way to lead to any kind of fruitful and positive outcome in the future.
That is the latest information we can get about the nuclear crisis on the Korean Peninsula. Now with me in the studio once again, we have Mr. Gui Yongtao, who is the Associate Professor from Peking University. Professor, you are an expert about Japan in China.
The UN resolution will help realize the denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. China will continue to work with all parties concerned to resolve dispute through dialogue and consultation.
Hong Lei also denied reports that DPRK had told China it was prepared to carry out more nuclear tests or rocket launches this year.
I do not know where the Reuters report comes from. Maintaining peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia is in the interests of all parties and requires joint efforts by all parties. The current situation is sensitive and complicated.
The nuclear test has also sparked debate among
For our show by Mr. Gui Yongtao, who is the assistant professor of the Peking University. Professor, before we go to a discussion with you about the latest situation, let's take a look at this background report.
The DPRK is the only country that has carried out nuclear tests in the 21st century.
the DPRK's third nuclear test has infuriated the international community.
As we stand by our allies, strengthen our own missile defense, and lead the world in taking firm action in response to these threats.
Pyongyang's defiance has once again brought its neighbors concern. Shortly after the test, China once again expressed its strong opposition to such action.
Hello, you're watching Dialogue live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm Tian Wei. China dismissed media reports recently suggesting that DPRK had informed Beijing of plans to carry out more nuclear tests. The Chinese Foreign Ministry warned against any actions that could worsen the situation on the Korean Peninsula and said diplomacy is underway on the crisis. To understand more about the latest situation there after the DPRK recent nuclear tests, I'm joined in the studio for the first half.
The Chinese public.
As a responsible nation, China should go with the international community and start from the interest of the Chinese people.
If we don't put sanctions on the DPRK, things will go worse. After all, nuclear weapons will pose a threat to the region.
But are more sanctions the only answer? The West has long asked China to use its influence to restrain the DPRK from conducting nuclear tests. But some experts argue that China has done nothing wrong and will stick to its current position.
We have witnessed that zigzag of all these relationship happened. It's very